The thought arrives, and you accept it as fact. Someone doesn't reply to your message, and your mind quietly files it under rejection. A presentation goes slightly off script, and your brain labels it failure. Not a rough draft of reality. Fact. But what if the problem isn't what happened? It's the story your mind wrote about it in the 2 seconds after. That gap between event and meaning is where cognitive reframing lives. And learning to stand in it changes more than your mood. This is not about positive thinking. That is the first thing worth clearing up. Cognitive reframing is not the instruction to look on the bright side or to paste a smile over something painful. It is something more precise and, honestly, more difficult. It is the practice of examining the interpretive layer that sits between what happens and what you feel, and asking whether that layer is accurate. Your brain does this automatically, thousands of times a day. Something occurs. Your mind reaches for a meaning. That meaning shapes your emotional response before you have had a chance to question it. Most of the time, you never question it at all, because the thought doesn't arrive with a label that says interpretation. It arrives feeling like truth. This happens with small things: an unanswered email, a short reply, a moment of silence in a conversation. Each one gets filed. Each one gets a meaning attached. And that meaning is usually made from whatever mood or expectation you are already carrying into the moment. What reframing offers is not a replacement truth. It offers you the awareness that an interpretation was happening in the first place. That might sound modest. It is actually a significant shift in how you relate to your own mind. In 1964, psychologist Albert Ellis had already been developing what he called rational emotive behavior therapy for nearly a decade. The core claim was direct. It is not events that cause emotional disturbance, but the beliefs we hold about events. Ellis distinguished between rational beliefs, flexible, proportionate, and grounded, and irrational ones, which tend to be absolute, catastrophizing, and self-defeating. What struck researchers about this framework was how measurable it turned out to be. When Beck began developing cognitive behavioral therapy around the same time, he found something similar while working with patients experiencing depression. The thinking patterns were not random. Beck identified specific, recurring distortions, catastrophizing, overgeneralization, personalization, that appeared consistently across patients. These were not personality quirks. They were habits of interpretation. What surprises me most about Beck's early work is how ordinary the distortions are. You don't need a clinical diagnosis to recognize them. You've probably caught yourself thinking that a single mistake defines your competence entirely, or that one difficult week proves something permanent about your life. Beck described this in Cognitive Therapy of Depression, published in 1979, and it remains one of the most cited texts in clinical psychology. Later research confirmed what Ellis and Beck had observed. James Gross at Stanford studied what he called cognitive reappraisal, deliberately reinterpreting the meaning of an emotional situation, and compared it with the more common strategy of suppression. Reappraisal came out significantly ahead. People who habitually reappraised difficult situations reported lower negative affect, better relationships, and higher well-being overall. Suppression reduced the outward expression of emotion, but did little for the internal experience. The distinction matters. Reframing is not suppression. It is an upstream intervention, changing the interpretation before the emotional response is even generated. Here is the part that often gets missed. Your brain is already reframing constantly. The question is not whether you interpret experience. You cannot avoid it. The question is whether the interpretations you are running are serving you or quietly holding you in place. Kahneman's work in Thinking Fast and Slow, published in 2011, is useful here. He describes two systems of thinking. System 1, which is fast, automatic, and associative, and System 2, which is slow, deliberate, and effortful. Most of our interpretive responses to events run through System 1. The conclusion arrives before the reasoning does. By the time you consciously register the thought, it already feels like perception rather than judgment. This is why reframing requires deliberate effort, at least at first. You are asking System 2 to catch what System 1 just filed away as settled. That feels awkward. It is supposed to. You are interrupting a process that was designed to run fast, because fast pattern matching was once more important than accurate pattern matching. The cost of that inherited speed is a brain that overfits negative meaning onto ambiguous events. Think about the last time someone gave you neutral feedback and your first response was to search it for criticism. Or the last time an unexpected silence in a conversation felt, for a moment, like disapproval. System 1 did that. It reached for the most available emotional template and applied it before you had a chance to consider whether it fit. The practice of reframing is not complicated, even if it is genuinely difficult. You notice the thought. You ask what assumption it rests on. You ask whether another explanation fits the same facts. You do not force yourself to believe a cheerful version. You simply refuse to let the first version stand unchallenged. Reframing is not something you do once in response to a bad day. It is a practice that gradually changes the default speed at which your brain reaches for certain meanings. Research on neuroplasticity supports this. The brain's interpretive pathways are not fixed. Repeated patterns of thought physically reshape neural circuits over time. This reflects the consistent findings associated with Donald Hebb's work on synaptic learning, often summarized as neurons that fire together wire together. The more often you interrupt a distorted interpretation and replace it with a proportionate one, the less effort that interruption requires over time. It becomes a faster reflex. Eventually, it becomes the default. Viktor Frankl, writing in Man's Search for Meaning in 1946, made a point that has stayed with me. He described the freedom to choose one's attitude toward a given set of circumstances as the last and most irreducible human freedom. Frankl was not describing forced optimism. He was describing a hard-won capacity to stand between a situation and your response to it, and make something intentional out of that space. That capacity is exactly what reframing trains over time. The practical starting point is modest. When a difficult thought arrives, write it down exactly as it appeared. Then ask one question. What would I need to believe for this thought to be definitely true? Often, the assumptions underneath are ones you have never consciously agreed to. Naming them is not the same as dissolving them, but it begins the process of holding them at a distance instead of living inside them. What reframing ultimately offers is not a better mood. It offers a more accurate relationship with your own experience. The ability to see that the story your brain handed you was always just one possible account of what happened, and that you have more authorship over that account than most of us ever bother to claim. If that idea interests you, there is more on this channel about how your mind constructs its version of reality, and what becomes possible when you start to understand that construction from the inside.